Quick introduction. We have Lucas to my left. Lucas Ndala is the current COO of Open Server Division of Telkom. He joined Telkom in 2015 as CFO and then became appointed COO in 2016. I have Malcolm Kirby, who's representing Seasway Connect and looks after their managed connectivity and services. And Hannes Pieterse from Lightstruck Holdings, who has extensive experience in infrastructure projects on the continent. Thank you, gentlemen. So, to address the topic, we really need to look into the future of our customers. I think that's a good starting point. My first question is then, what does the customer of the future look like, and how is this impacting networks today and convergence? Lucas.
Thank you, Lloyd, and firstly, thanks to the FTTX Council for inviting me this year again. In terms of where we are sitting at today and looking at the customers that we are looking at, and I'm talking from OpenServe as an infrastructure provider, we're starting to see a changing customer base where the customers of today are a little bit more informed. They know what they want and what they should expect from an infrastructure provider, where they basically look for reliability in the service that they get, speed, but also, consistency in terms of the service that gets provided. And also, the speed to provide a service. I think today's customer is less patient in terms of the waiting time. So he expects to interact with you in a much more seamless way, where digital platforms start to play a critical part, where they can, choose and slice on what they can or what they want and when they want it.
Malcolm, your view?
Yeah, I think, Lucas, I agree with you. The customer is now clever. I think gone are the days when the customer would come to us for advice. The customer actually tells us what he wants. He's not interested in your infrastructure anymore. The customer is more interested in the services you can deliver, and as you said, how quickly and how reliably can you deliver the service. Whether it's over fibre, 5G, Wi-Fi, 4G, from a customer point of view, that's of no interest to them. And I take myself, my mobile phone must be connected. If I'm not in a Wi-Fi zone, I need my mobile phone. The fact that I'm using one of the MNOs is purely I have no choice. And the fact that I'm using my fixed line operator is also because I don't really have much choice. But as a customer, I need to get to my services. And I really don't care how it happens. And I think customers are dictating that more and more. And as infrastructure providers, service providers, we now have to start listening more seriously to what our customers are demanding from us.
Hannes?
Thanks, Lloyd. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to sit with you, colleagues. Yeah, my view from a layer one or an infrastructure perspective, as Lloyd said in the beginning, is a bit different. And because I don't necessarily see the customer in that sense. So if I just look at statistics, I mean, I was personally very impressed about the numbers that came from Minister Swele's notes when he was speaking to us this morning. So I'm not going to refer to his numbers, but just according to IDC data and other relevant data that I think you all get in reports, we know there's about 28 million people that's got mobile phones in South Africa. We know the numbers of, let's say, just the ADSL market and what the FTTH market has eaten into that. So, and I think that's where we normally play in the clever part of the consumer market. But I mean, for me, the interesting thing in the consumer journey is really that journey from outside the fixed line. So how do we give connectivity to 21 million internet users in South Africa? And how creative is that network? So I think if you look at that perspective, the consumers just probably need basic, adequate connectivity in that sense. I agree with what my colleagues say, but we just need to be cognizant of the next wave of customer that we will get through different technologies.
Good point. It actually leads me to my next question. How is network convergence currently impacting operators' business focus?
I think from as OpenServe, the way we look at it now, we're starting to look at it in a much more integrated way, where our network planning, actually the convergence between fixed and wireless, is getting closer and closer. And whereby every time you build a fixed network, you have to build it with a mindset of how do I enable the other wireless technologies that will rely on that network in terms of either backhaul or the end customer at home. Because remember now, the customer has got both mobility when he's on the road, but when he gets home, he wants to almost migrate back onto the fixed network. So how do we build that smart network that can be able to seamlessly migrate the customer? So where we're looking at as OpenServe is we're starting to modernize our network, and I think with a bigger push on fiber being the next generation connectivity, that fast-speed connectivity. But also when we start building, we start to build with a notion of build once, use multiple times, because we're recognizing that even though we're building fiber as OpenServe, because we provide the whole spectrum from carrier services to enterprise, to your end consumer. So we have to build with that mindset that we're building for everyone, not necessarily for fiber to the home. So what we're also seeing as well is with this changing customer base, also how do you create a much more easier interaction between yourselves and your various customers or various clients. So what we also do is that our systems now needs to make sure that as part of integrating that network, you build support systems that could make it easily seamless, and where the customer doesn't necessarily see any difference between the whole ecosystem within your shop. So one of the things that we are doing as OpenServe that we're chasing a little bit aggressively is around creating a digital ecosystem around enabling that environment.
Thank you. Malcolm, your view?
Yeah, I'm looking at the South African market now, where we have a couple of MNOs, mobile network operators, that really control the mobile space, and there's a couple of fixed mobile or fixed operators that are encroaching into their space. And what the operators are now finding, their bit-based business, selling the bits where they make their money, is now being eaten away amongst themselves and their competitors. So the FTTH guys are eating away at the spare cash that the mobile guys actually want to make. And the mobile guys need the FTTH guys to bring the consumers closer to them. So between the two of them, they're fighting for spare cash, selling bits at different prices, and that's the way they're trying to attract the clients. I think they have to move away from that and become more services oriented, so that the client buys the service. He doesn't really care where he gets the service from. And the mobile and fixed operators in South Africa have to start working more closely together, because the pie is only so big. And the bits that they're selling, there's a pool, anyone can buy the bits now and sell it to the consumer. Change the way you're selling to the consumer and stop selling the consumer bits. Sell the consumer a service and a solution, and then you'll start attracting the money or the loose cash that's floating around where the consumer decides where to spend. So it's very important for both types of operators to actually start getting closer. And it's not just the mobile guys, the fixed wireless guys that are rolling out Wi-Fi meshes in there. They're also eating away at the MNO's spare cash. So all of them actually have to start building these converged networks, and you're probably going to end up with 2, maybe 3 converged networks in this country, where they each have their niche market, but the business will be about selling services and not selling bits anymore.
Hannes, your view?
Thanks, Lloyd. Yeah, if I look again from my view into the market, I think that we talk too much about those competitive networks in the cities, and we fight too much for the same LSM. If I look at the bigger problem for a country to be connected, and I put my infrastructure hat on, fiber is really for me a next generation digital utility. And if I put that hat on, my question is, who will have fiber in 20 years or 25 years? Because a utility is forever. It's not a short-term network. The answer is everyone. Well, everyone is probably not feasible, but as far as it is feasible. So from that view, deeper into the network, back from different technologies, putting up, my fiber infrastructure at. If it's from a base station or from a wireless tower or from a service location being home or business, of course somewhere there's enough networks to meet up and build redundancy. And so yeah, from our view, we're all about collaboration as far as possible, to share what we built and to share what's already there.
Network convergence will ultimately, drive networks to look the same, hopefully reducing capex. It'll result in standardization to a certain extent. How would operators maintain their competitiveness when this convergence happens?
So I think from where I'm sitting, I think the one area of competitiveness that guys will need to look at is through this evolving cycle. One, can you continue to maintain your network at the right quality? One. But secondly, there's a need for reinvestment in your network. Your ability to reinvest in the network, and also to have almost what I call a cradle-to-grave technology strategy, where when you implement a technology, you can also start thinking of the end in mind in terms of when and how are you gonna retire the technology and replace it with reasonable technology. So that reinvestment philosophy will be critical in terms of maintaining that level, but also being able to migrate with the evolution of customers. Because there's a lot of, as part of this convergence, we're starting to talk IoT. All of those things is on the back of this infrastructure play that we're talking about today. So how do we evolve ourselves in the light of that? And I think for myself as OpenServe, because I also have some of the legacy technologies, is the speed with which I migrate faster becomes critical. But also the other element that we will also need to put in mind or bear in mind is that, how do we continue to build skills in the market? Because that's one area that we sometimes forget about in terms of the skills to support this technology. So reinvesting in our people, training and development of our people becomes critical as well. Because if you leave them behind, you might build this Rolls Royce that actually no one can maintain or fix it. So that for us is critical.
Valid point. Malcolm, your view?
Yeah, pretty much what you say. You have to look at the infrastructure, and there's a lot of reinvestment and upgrading. And if you take the MNO space, they went from 2G to 3G to 4G, and 5G is coming. Every time they invest in a new technology, it takes a lot of money, and the payback period is getting a little bit longer because the investment is getting so much higher. So there's a lot of problems for these guys to keep reinvesting and keeping this network up to date. Where we come to the fiber guys, the reinvestment is probably not as onerous as in the mobile space. And if we go back to the previous question, that's where these guys have to merge and start working closer. Because if they work closer and they provide the services for the customer or the consumer, they're going to have the stickiness. And if you don't have stickiness with your customers, you're not going to have guaranteed revenues, and your revenues is going to fluctuate. You're going to have churn, which we're all experiencing now in the South African market. So if we can converge these connectivity platforms and get stickiness with your customers, provide them more services, because they're going to pay for the services. They're not going to pay for your network. And then your return on investment can probably grow at a nice rate, and it will become more predictable.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Lloyd. And thanks to my colleagues. Again, with my view on fiber as infrastructure, and maybe just those for you that hasn't got the full context what I mean, is if we just think layered around networks, layer one, of course, is always the passive portion, and that means, no, not the trench, but the ducts, the manholes, the physical fiber, the splice enclosures, and so forth. And then you've got the layer two, the equipment or the active portion, and then, of course, layer three, the services. So I, again, just want to talk about that first layer of infrastructure. And I personally, I'm blessed with colleagues that has done a lot of infrastructure finance, project finance, throughout Southern Africa, throughout Africa, and actually into Europe. And those principles became very valuable to me. So I'm not convinced that you will begin to save in infrastructure from that view. I think we will spend a bit more. And I do think the market probably still dominated, in the private sector by good young entrepreneurs that's built a lot of great networks the last few years, hasn't applied the best principles around infrastructure that's probably needed for a long-term view on the infrastructure. And that doesn't pertain to the quality of the network. It probably pertains to the financing principles, and to make those financing principles applicable just on the infrastructure principle as far as possible. We all know that a network that's active, it's just a shorter time that network can live because the mean time between failures are so low. But on infrastructure that's passive, it's actually a really long-term view. The moment that you put that 20-25-year hat on and you push that through into the supply chain, the numbers can make sense to build a really quality network with different capex and structured mechanisms in the finance.
Thank you. So, if you had a crystal ball, how would you summarize the future of fiber operators?
I think it's not an easy question, but I think one of the key things that we're going to see, especially in the South African market, is consolidation of the players. I think we do have a lot of players in the fiber space, so there'll be consolidation because you need scale. So if you don't have scale, either you have to become a very good niche player where your value proposition actually becomes quite critical, or to capture a particular audience, and maybe where you can be able to charge maybe a premium price for that. So consolidation is inevitable, and I think we started seeing that, Vumatel, DFA, and then I think this is the start of a phase, because if you don't have scale, when you have to reinvest in your network, how do you do that? Also, the assurance aspect comes into play, your ability to maintain the network, and also whether you become a local player from a regional perspective, or a provincial or interregional or national player, or also with the undersea enablement. So we'll see quite a lot of consolidation in the market. Ideally, I think as a first phase, you'll see probably maybe 4 or 5 key players. And then I think thereafter, I think there would be another second phase of consolidation. And for me, I'm saying where the environment is moving, I say we should expect almost some of the non-traditional telco guys to start making an acquisition in the telco space. Just to give you an example, we get to a stage where somebody like a Naspers acquire one of the big telcos. It's a possibility. Do you have somebody like maybe one of the big banks acquiring a telco? Those possibilities are major. So we're going to see that panning out as we evolve. And I think one thing that we also forget, South African market has actually been quite interesting. If you compare it with some of the international markets, I think South Africa is quite unique in that we almost seem to defy some of the global trends. And I think South Africans are quite savvy to adopt technology quicker. And actually what we're seeing is that as this becomes the biggest disruptor in our daily lives, because where we're moving to more and more smarter people. So even, it will come to the people that we employ as a network provider. Actually, you might move away from employing purely technical people. As you start doing this analytics and everything, the behavioral sciences might become a big factor in, some of the key skills that, organization might require. So we're seeing this nice movement, which I think at the moment, if I had a crystal ball, and I always say to guys, when I talk about the space that we are in, I say, the customers are like little kids with a lollipop, and sitting in the sand playing and imagining all these possibilities. So they almost live like in a dreamland, but which becomes a reality. When you start looking at the customer, where these guys can start providing solutions in terms of collaboration. If you look at, that fiber player of the future might be where you find a fiber player collaborating with a security company, where your security network in the home, when you leave home, you can just seamlessly hand it over to the security company. They can monitor for you, with the facial recognitions and everything. And you can say, these are the people that are allowed in my yard, as an example. And if Lucas jumps into your yard, then, you'll see a patrol coming over. that's the world of possibilities that if I look at the fiber player of the future that we might end up at.
Thank you. Malcolm, your view?
Yeah, I agree very much with what Lucas is saying. The industry is changing so much, but if we take the customer or the consumer out of the picture and we look at where the fiber operators are going, where the mobile operators are going, and the fixed wireless guys are going, they're encroaching, as I said earlier, they're encroaching on each other's space. But then if we look at how we're delivering these services that the consumer wants, everyone sitting in this room connects to a network somewhere along the line across a wireless connection. And in South Africa, probably most of the world, everyone says if you've got Wi-Fi, you've got internet. Actually, Wi-Fi is just the connection to the point that gives you the internet. But what I'm saying is all of us connect to our services via a Wi-Fi router somewhere along the line. So if we take 5G, do I care if this router's in my study or if it's on a lamp pole outside in the street? To me, it makes no difference. It's a wireless connection. I can connect my device and I can carry on doing what I have to do. I think the operators, the fixed guys, the mobile guys, and the fixed wireless guys need to consider this, and maybe the fixed wireless guys are sitting at a little bit of an advantage because they are tending that way as well, and the fiber guys now need to start looking at the fixed wireless guys, but the mobile operators can't operate without the fiber guys. So you now have this incestuous hate relationship between the three guys, but they can't live without each other. And I think the operator of the future is going to have to take those areas of conflict and turn it into something that's sellable to the consumer to make their lives easier. So I think, and my colleague on my left here, I think Telkom, sitting with a mixture of everything, if they get it right, they have a big leap in the market. For the other guys, they're going to have to make friends with people and with partners and put this all together so they can come back with a converged solution in the industry. So there's a lot of challenges ahead for the new operators. To start from scratch, you need a couple of billion rand. So that's not going to happen overnight. But yes, alternative investors, investors who are investing in this infrastructure to sell their services. We've got Amazon, we've got Google, Facebook, all tending towards that way. So the new operators of the future are going to look very different to what we're seeing at the moment. And I do believe they're going to be working a lot closer, if not mergers and acquisitions. And we're seeing that starting to happen in South Africa at the moment.
Thank you. Hannes?
Yeah, thanks, Lucas and Malcolm. Makes sense what you say. To just tie into that with your humongous network, Lucas, and I look at just again what Minister Swele said this morning. He said we need 8 or 9 times more investment that was injected up to this point. If we just take the numbers, so again, let's go back to the basic IDC numbers to say 28 million mobile devices, 21 million internet users. Some of them cannot use it, it's too expensive still, or there's no coverage, so it's more. It will be much more than that. And you just give a capex of 2,000 rand for a decent connectivity, whatever technology that is. And you make that number over the next 20 years, 30 million people that needs another investment on existing technology or a new technology for the future. I mean, we're talking about probably close to 100 billion rand investment that I think is still needed. I mean, we've got a company as well just outside South Africa, Namibia, and in another country as well. And we see that even more there, where there's less networks, less penetration, and a less, more immature model of what we have here in terms of good coverage already. So I'm quite excited about the future. I think that the difficult thing will be on how we, as my colleague said, converge, but also how do we find that model for, let's name a town like Greyton. There's 500 houses in Greyton. It's 30 kilometers from the nearest long-haul network. You cannot build 30 kilometers of fiber, or can you? And that's the question. So now, how do you do that? And how do you collaborate to do that for 500 consumers? So will Greyton never have fiber, as an example? They will. So what is the route there? And how do we find it as an industry together?
Exactly. I think the network changes, specifically with convergence, needs to start now if we're going to prepare for the future. With that, one of the current changes we could, that I experience now that are impacting your network builds?
I think some of the current changes that are impacting on our network build, I think one from dealing with the municipalities, I think access to lifts, I think it's one of the bigger challenges. The second one is around access to skills because we are competing for this number of limited skills within the industry. So that's another challenge. Thirdly, I think it's an issue around regulation, and for me, I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. In that, I think the space, I was saying to my colleagues at work that if you look at the telecoms industry in the last 10 years, it has almost leapfrogged to an equivalent of 60 years in the Industrial Revolution. And the regulatory environment is lagging. So, which means from a regulatory perspective, we might need to start getting a regulator that needs to be forward-looking in terms of how he regulates the industry. But also, what you're also finding is that with now some of the Googles, the Amazons, the way the regulator looks at the market might need to be slightly different with a different head. If you look at Russia, China, where they're now insisting that the guys must be resident in China, host out of China. So those are some of the things that are impacting on from a regulatory environment. But it's not only the regulatory, it's also from the government fiscus, because it's a shifting of revenue for the fiscus in terms of where the revenue is taxed. So there's a whole lot of things that are challenging in our environment, not only from an infrastructure player, but also the various players that are sitting within that infrastructure that we are supporting. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting space, fast-paced, that will require a different way of thinking, and also a different way of how we plan for our network into the future.
Malcolm, what do you think?
I agree very much with you on the regulatory side. They have to start looking at this very differently. The market has morphed massively, and the regulatory framework has not changed. I think the DOC needs to get a bit closer to the regulatory thing to get services to the masses and to the people. Having said that, we also have to have continuity within the municipalities. Municipalities treat infrastructure providers differently. I think we all know, for example, Tshwane now has put a hold on just about everyone. I don't think anyone can afford to trench in Tshwane, which is bad for Tshwane. But for some reason or whatever, that's the decisions they made and the choices they made. And there are other municipalities around the country that also make it very difficult for infrastructure providers to deploy infrastructure. So that's a really critical matter. And I think that's a national issue. It's not a municipal issue. There should be an agreed process across all municipalities, which they can't change, almost like the Constitution, if you want to put it that way. So that's a really big problem for infrastructure deployment in this country. And then capital investment. Institutional investors in this country want a payback of 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 years. If you're in the telecoms game and you're there for a long term, your fiber is going to last 25 years. Your microwave infrastructure is going to last maybe 15 years. Yes, your mobile infrastructure gets replaced every 7 years or so. So your return on investment cannot be a normal 2 to 3 year or 5 year investment. And if we take some of the large institutional investors, and a colleague of mine is probably going to smile when I say this, they'll go and build a massive building and they'll want their money back over 20 years because they built this massive building for X amount of millions. They'll put the same amount of millions of fiber into the ground where they guaranteed a return, but they want 3 or 4 years out of the fiber. There's a mindset that has to change from the investor space in this country as well. It's a long-term investment, it's an annuity investment, so your returns are guaranteed. And if we can't get the investment mindset or the investment market to look at it that way, infrastructure deployment will slow down in this country, and we need to look at it from that angle as well.
Hannes?
Thanks, Lloyd. Maybe just a point on what Malcolm ended with is, Malcolm, we've seen now in the institutional, the money market in South Africa that, it is possible to get a tenure of 10 to 15 years if the modeling that the industry present to the institutional market is correct. I think it's probably a fault just as much with us in terms of wrong approach towards that. But I think that approach can change, and we've seen it now that the tenure on money available can be much longer. So that's great. So if I come back to the actual question, and that is just looking at problems, I would probably summarize it as three problems. The one is to not run away if you pass service locations, but to actually connect them and to get revenue quicker. And I think everybody is struggling with that on different levels: service delivery, subcontractor skill, maintainability. I think there is an inherent demand in the market. We see the consumers phoning Lucas on his cell phone. So I think that's available. So I think the industry can just get a lot more effective there by connecting. A second one is, I agree with Lucas as well. The wayleave problem is, really big. You get somebody in a very small council where there's actually no wayleave person. There's no address to submit the wayleave because they've never seen a private investment of scale in a small town. OpenServe might have an easier route there because it's maybe refreshing of existing network, of a proportional upgrade. But for a totally new player and a new investment and a new approach, it is difficult to get into a council where there's a very junior person that's not an engineer, that's doing the best that person can, but the gap is just so big between that application and what's in that municipality. And the more we roll out now in the final stage of Fibre in South Africa, I think the more we need to work hard to get that right. So the whole discussions earlier today, of course, pertain to that. The final one, which I think is difficult, is how we smash up collaboration. I mean, one example for me is currently I don't know if you know, but it's a bit public knowledge, but in Windhoek at the moment, the Metro Police has actually stopped all fibre deployment, chasing contractors from site. I mean, that's terrible from all providers in terms of not understanding how the city and the industry can collaborate, because both has got the same dream. It's totally possible to collaborate, but somewhere there's a mix, a bad ingredient in that mix, and the cake is not being baked. So that's destructive, and I think we also then need to work hard on those high-level collaborative joint development agreements, or whatever you call them.
Clearly, lots to look forward to as networks evolve, including challenges. I think closing comments, guys, from you on the topic and future and the future of fibre operators.
I think probably from where we're sitting, I think one of the key things that as an industry will have to come closer with is around probably collaboration, which some of the speakers have already spoken to. And also, how do we start to speak with one voice, either facing the regulatory environment and all of that. So that would become quite critical. And the other key element is around, as an industry, how do we start to invest in the skills? I think currently, without a doubt, I think probably I feel as one of the guys that provide the skills for the industry. If anyone wants to employ, it comes through my shop first. But how do we provide the skills, especially within the fixed infrastructure space? Because I think that's where we've got a lot of skill shortages, and we're faced with an aging workforce in that space. So there is a need for us to look at how we invest in that space. And I think lastly, it's around how do we evolve ourselves to become the least cost provider in the market. The customers are expecting more for less, whether it's a carrier service or it's an enterprise customer or it's a household or a consumer customer. They expect the price to continuously drop. I say this is one market which defies the logic of demand and supply, where now it seems like with more demand, suppliers are expecting the price to drop. So those are some of the challenges that we are faced with in the market. And also, how do we have access to capital for future investment and reinvestment purposes? Because if you are faced with a dropping revenue line, you need to find better ways of dropping your cost structure to become relevant to the market.
Malcolm?
Yeah, thanks. I think for fibre operators, the future's pretty bright. I think for mobile operators, it's also very bright. I think if the two of them can work closer together, their market and their opportunity for returns will grow exponentially. The wireless or microwave side of the business will become more last mile than anything else, and the fibre guys will be taking the big data, extracting it out of the mobile network and putting the fat pipes back to where the services are delivered, and they will then in that way take a lot of the bit load off the mobile networks. And between the two of them, that's a very good marriage. So if they get that right and the convergence takes place like we all saying it should, I think the two of them together can build a very good network. But it's really around converging and about understanding where your space is and how do we make money out of the total solution, and we're obviously going to have to share the revenue somewhere along the line. But it's really an understanding of whose space is what and how do we make each other's space work to the benefit of both parties.
How is your view?
Yeah, it's maybe a philosophical thing that I want to, and I mean it's maybe closer to a calling. And it's a question that I think the leaders in the industry need to ask themselves, and that is how serious are we to, because the topics that we mainly discuss and the points that we go back to is mainly, you know, around the existing networks. And I think there's so much opportunities that we really need to challenge ourselves to say, how serious are we to apply our minds to complete this network rollout in South Africa and do the hard yards actually to do that and to be creative. And I know there's a lot of opportunities, but there's also threats, and sometimes we create threats or we enlarge them. And I think that for us to work really hard, talk to each other, collaborate, spend time together, to turn those threats into opportunities as a high-level view on that, I think can take us just far in the future.
Thank you, panelists. We'll turn to the audience now for questions.
Yeah, not everyone together.
Okay, it seems.
Thank you very much, Heinz Swart from CCC. I've just got a question for all the panelists. I think Hannes and Lucas touched on it, but there seems to be a drive in South Africa for constant reduction of prices. It seems to be a race to zero. And I just want to understand from an infrastructure provider's point of view, seeing that you need to maintain your infrastructure, how sustainable is that to constantly drop your prices and still maintain a good quality network? Is it sustainable, or is there actually a point where we'll need to look at increasing our prices to the consumer?
See, can I start, Lucas? Thanks, Hein. I think what's difficult, again, as an infrastructure provider, is to work with a market that from the consumer, because we will never sell a service to a consumer. We will wholesale dark services, or we do, to active partners, which upsells that. So if you just look at any infrastructure, road, harbour, railway line, infrastructure and the deployment around infrastructure will always have at least a CPI tracker, probably bigger in some portions of infrastructure. So if you take a really long view on infrastructure, just in the portion where it's in the whole service offering, that portion cannot lower. It might be priced wrongly today, but in a mature, standardized, stable market, it will always have a slight tracker, and if it's not there, it will show its consequences in due time. So in a new network, it can disappear. In a long-term view, it cannot. The top layers can, you know, there's always new equipment, firmware, and new upgrades and new versions and new technology, and there's definitely a downward curve. And of course, we all know that the international breakout and all the other prices has gone steeply down. So and I think that's the biggest saving, of course, that we see, and it's given through. Nobody likes to lose revenue, of course, but at least from the infrastructure view, it's a steady climb in a healthy market.
I think probably from our side, the key is, one, I think in the face of reducing prices, we are forced to relook at our cost structures. And I think talking for myself as OpenServe, one of the measures that we've introduced for ourselves is to start calculating what we call the cost per line. So, and we try to benchmark that measure across regions and to say, how do you continuously drive that line down? But also in that space as well, we have to balance driving your cost down and also maintaining your infrastructure. Because if you cut too deep, you might lose your ability to maintain the infrastructure. That might compromise the service that you're already providing to the customers. So it's not an easy thing. I think at a point, the customers will start realizing that actually for you have to start paying probably a premium for a good service. And I think customers will start be willing to pay a good price for a good offering, because it will go beyond just connectivity. When you are down as a customer, how quickly can your service provider provide you with a service? So I think where we probably might see potential revenue streams is where maybe provide timelines that if I fix your line within 8 hours, maybe you pay a premium price. Then maybe if I fix it maybe over a particular period, maybe it's just a standard cost. So those are some of the differentiators that as a market will have to start thinking around as we evolve, and also as the customer needs changes to align with the demands and needs of the customers.
Yeah, and sorry if I can just add to that, and exactly the cost of the service, the infrastructure cost is always going to be there, but if you start charging now for the quality of what you're delivering at a layer 1 and layer 2 level, there is a price to pay. If you want diversity with separacy, if you want latency guarantees, if you want voice quality guarantees, etc., that's all a payable service that you're delivering to the client. So that's going to become more and more prevalent, and then you're going to get to what some term broadband. That's where your contented internet. Your gamers at home don't want that. They want more of a guaranteed response time for gaming. Your bankers want a guaranteed latency across the network. So those sort of things will start becoming more and more prevalent in the costing models. And yes, it eventually has to bottom out. But if you stick to the bit-based type of economy that the telecoms industry is more or less in at this stage, you're gonna keep going down. And as Hannah said, your internet breakout prices are just dropping. So you've got to add some sort of value to what you're providing, and probably it'll be at the layer 1 and layer 2 levels that the real value will come into place, and that's really at the infrastructure levels.
And maybe just lastly to add, I think also as we invest in new technologies, your cost to operate that technology drops. So it will require us, maybe especially incumbent players like us, the speed with which we invest in newer technologies will become more and more critical.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, good.
Great.
Thank you, panelists, again, and over to Dobek.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.